good evening, everybody. Sandy, thank you for the invitation. Paula, the hospitality. And Craig, this is the most technologically savvy setup I've ever had in my life. I feel like there's a big, beetle just hovering in front of my face, but I'm going to get used to it. And I'm glad everyone can hear not only tonight, the folks in person, but folks online as well. I think you can see me. Yep. I stand very still right here. Hopefully the folks at home can see me. Tonight we're here to talk about a tree that, as Sandy said, a lot of folks have a love-hate relationship with. It goes by a number of names: ash juniper, mountain cedar, blueberry cedar, and also that damn cedar. I am really glad that I have Elizabeth McGreevy with me here tonight. She just wrote the gold standard, top-notch book on this tree, which is excellent because basically any question that y'all have tonight, I'm just going to do this and say, Elizabeth, what's the answer? So really glad that she's here with me tonight. All right, let's go to the next slide. Looks like there might be a lag. Bear with me, folks. We can do this the old-fashioned way. Hold on, folks. Okay. Thank you, Craig. So again, my name is Daniel Oppenheimer. I am the Land Program Manager at the Hill Country Alliance. We are a regional nonprofit organization. We work across 17 counties in Central Texas to conserve the things that make this the beautiful place we know and love. Our programs focus on land, water, night skies, and communities. If you'd like to learn more about us, go to hillcountryalliance.org. We've got an amazing newsletter. It comes out 1 to 2 times a month, distills all the conservation news happening in the region, as well as all the great educational events that not only HCA, but all of our partners are hosting as well. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Craig. We're good. So what are we here to talk about tonight? Well, Elizabeth and I are going to tag team this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the land. Specifically, what did it look like when the first European settlers stumbled upon this part of Texas? Then Elizabeth is going to get up here and she's going to demystify some of the tall tales that we hear about this infamous tree, the ash juniper, aka mountain cedar. And then we're going to talk a little bit about if, when, why, and how someone might want to control a cedar, and perhaps think about that in a more broad, holistic sense through land stewardship. And then Elizabeth's going to bring it home and share a few big takeaways for us all to think about over the holidays. So here we are in Gillespie County. Folks at home, perhaps you're in Gillespie County, perhaps you're elsewhere. Black arrow. And the blue represents the Edwards Plateau. And we are really lucky to live in the hill country. We're lucky for a whole bunch of reasons. But one is the rich natural heritage and biological diversity of this place we call home. And a lot of that has to do with our underlying geology and the fact that we sit here at the confluence of 7 ecological regions. So if you go west, you get out to the Trans-Pecos, so the Chihuahuan Desert. Head up north, you get to several different plains ecosystems, and the cross timbers. East, of course, is the Blackland Prairie. Down south, we've got the South Texas brush country. So because we're at the crossroads of all these different ecological regions coming together, we've just got an incredible diversity. Of course, that varies as you go from west to east. We have the drier side gets about 15 inches a year as you're on the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert. As you head east, you get up to 30, 33 inches of rain. We've got about 54 fish species native to the Texas Hill Country, and some of those are endemic, and you will not find them anywhere else on the earth. It's pretty incredible. Guadalupe bass, of course, is our state fish, and that is endemic to the Hill Country. So a bunch of really amazing aquatic organisms that only live here, nowhere else. Of course, this is the Native Plant Society, so I don't need to tell you all these types of things, but we've got over 140 woody species of trees and shrubs. Any guesses on the grasses? Pretty good. Over 200 species of native grasses. How about birds? Over 400. So we got a lot going on here in the Hill Country. I mean, look at that. That's an incredible amount of diversity and complexity, ecological complexity. And so oftentimes when we think about how to manage, how to steward our land, we like to look back at history as a point of reference, perhaps to set some goalposts. And so that begs the question of, okay, what part of history? And oftentimes people gravitate towards, what did the land look like when those first European settlers stumbled upon this area? There's a phenomenal book by a man named Del Winiger. Del Winiger was a professor at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio. And he wrote this book. He's most well known for his books on Texas cactus, but he's got these great books here that talk about what the land looked like before 1860s. And he went through a lot of effort combing through all the diaries and journals of the first European settlers, especially before the 1860s. Dozens of accounts. And what did he find? The Hill Country was not this endless sea of saddle high grasses. It was not a stroll in the park to get your horses and your wagons from one end to the other, but rather it was a really rich and complex patchwork of woodlands, open grasses, savanna, and shrubland. And guess what was there in some of those woodlands and shrublands? Our friend, or perhaps our enemy, to be determined. Ash juniper and mountain cedar. So let's dig in. Again, he looked at accounts from all over the Hill Country, but let's pick out a couple of explorers who were right here in the Pedernales River Basin. We've got Bernardo de Miranda, who came through. He came from, I think it was the Blanco River Basin to the Pedernales, and he talked a lot about how difficult it was. I mean, think about how easy it is today to get from Blanco to Fredericksburg. That's take 1623. You're here in 40 minutes. 8 leagues. That's 24 miles. And he just talked about how complex and difficult it was navigating. For folks at home, I'm going to read this out. Crossing many swollen creeks and thickets of cedar and oak timber at a distance of 8 leagues, we arrived at the Arroyo de los Pedernales. It was not an easy jaunt to get from the Blanco to the Pedernales. There were lots of hills, a lot of rocky slopes, and again, really dense thickets of cedar and oak. Let's fast forward to 1839. Keep in mind, 1839 is before Fredericksburg, Stonewall, any of these towns have been founded. This is J.W. Benedict, who came, I think, from the Guadalupe to the Blanco. Similar to Miranda, he talked about how much of a pain in the you-know-what it was to try to navigate this country. The wild pine and the juniper grow here. We had a rocky descent into the valley through a broken surface covered with rocks and oak timbers. Yeah, not just a skip and a jump. It was tough getting through this country. So oftentimes we hear about how early European settlers saw bison. There were definitely plains bison here, but there were also a lot of woodland species. One of the largest being, any guesses? Black bear. We had black bear all over the Hill Country. So here's Victor Brock to the left, and Victor talked about this was again 1848. This was just a few years after Fredericksburg was first settled by European explorers. That black bears were common along the Pedernales. So common, in fact, this was dubbed Black Bear Paradise. Another quote from Ferdinand Raymer, who perhaps has one of the most detailed and rich accounts. He traveled from New Braunfels to Fredericksburg in the 1840s. And this is perhaps my favorite description of just all the black bears that we had right here in Fredericksburg. The Indians brought with them bear meat and bear fat, which they offered for sale. Not only was all the food cooked with bear oil during my stay in Fredericksburg, but the colonists also used it in their lamps instead of regular oil. How plentiful bears were near Fredericksburg was attested by the fact that each Indian often had 60 gallons of such fat for sale. So yes, there were bison, and Ferdinand Raymer and others talked about the bison, but this wasn't just some open grassland or prairie. We had thick timber, which provided habitat for black bears and other woodland species here in the 1800s. So if you step back and you look at all these early settlers' accounts, their journals, their diaries, and you step back, you see that the tops of the hills, they didn't all look the same. Some were dense thickets and groves. Some were heavy timber. Again, we heard that oak and cedar. Some were sparse forests. Some were bare, rocky, and arid. And again, lots of mention of cedar and oak. And yeah, the grasses were, those saddle high grasses were there. But again, they were just a part of this larger landscape. Let's go down from the tops of the hills to the hillsides. Accounts often noted rocky slopes, thickly timbered, which is to say they were really hard to get through. And those grasses were there too. The valleys, again, heading down the hill, some were densely wooded, some were prairies. And when they used the word prairies, they didn't mean just open grass, but again, a mix of trees and grasses and forbs. And just so across the landscape, we see this real diversity and complexity. Tall grasses, yes, species like switchgrass, big and little blue stem, Indian grass, and wild rye. But again, those big grasses coexisting with a variety of woody species too. So in addition to all of the early, the first European settlers, we can also look at the artwork. Here's an image on the left that was completed in 1850, a painting that shows the Pedernales River. And while we can't quite zoom in, you can get a sense of, yes, there were grasses. If you look at on those hillsides, especially in the background, you can see that there was a lot of dense vegetation on those hillsides. On the right here, the image is a little blurry, but this is a famous lithograph by Herman Lunkowitz. And you can tell this image is old because the way Fredericksburg is spelled has about extra letters than how we spell it now. And again, look at this. Yes, we've got some open grassy areas, but look at all this thick wooded area as well. So again, grasses, yes, but a lot of thick woodlands as well. We live now in a time of skepticism, which is all good and fine. And so if you're seeing any of this and say, I don't know if I want to take that guy's word for it, great. Go home and spend the holidays reading Raymer's Texas. It is a phenomenal account. There's a book here that captures 150 years of painting and photography around Fredericksburg. Go read some of the books about the cedar choppers and folks who use cedar and some of the other woody species to build their corrals, their homes, the shingles on their roof, the fence posts, charcoaling. I mean, you name it. This woody material, that was our Home Depot back then. And there's some incredible stories out there. With that, Elizabeth, I think I'm going to turn it over to you. Yes. So now we're going to get into the tall tales. And if you stand here, the folks can actually see you. Oh, there you go. Sorry.
Can y'all hear me? It's on? It's good. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of review, just kind of go through a few of the tall tales, as I call them, and about mountain cedars. And the ones I hear the most from people is that, are they water hogs? Aren't they invasive? Are they even native? Of course, I'm speaking to the Native Plant Society. As a 20-year Native Plant Society member, that was the first thing I wanted to find out, because I'm a native plant evangelist, right? And also, just like another thing here that's less directly related to these myths, but it's kind of like it's a follow-up to these issues, to these myths, is did they always form vast thickets that we see everywhere? When Daniel was talking about these thickets and cedars everywhere, is that what people were seeing 150 years ago? Oh, I see. You made it all tricky here with the. Okay, so the first question is, are they water hogs? Two studies in the 1990s that say the water use and the interception by the canopy and the leaf litter both kind of like came out with numbers that made it look, yeah, they do use a lot of water. And the first one was said that they use 33 gallons of water per day. And compare that to a live oak that was saying 19 gallons of water per day. So yeah, it looks like they're being, using up all the water. At the same time, an interception study came out that showed they were using 70 to 75% was being intercepted by the canopy and the leaf litter. So if they're using all of that water and they're not letting anything reach the ground, then obviously they must be water hogs. That was kind of like the consensus, and the media just grabbed that and put it out there for everyone. It became gospel. Excuse me. Interesting is that Dr. Keith Owens was the one who did the 1996 water use study. So I called him to ask him about this, and he just was like, oh my gosh. He said that was never meant to become gospel. That was is like me doing an estimate. I did it really quickly. It wasn't hard science, and I only looked at one tree. And since that time, he has continued the research, because if you read the abstract, it's like a lot of people, what they do is that they see the scientific paper and they just read the title and like the first few sentences. They may not read the entire abstract, because at the bottom of the abstract, he clarifies. He says, I was only looking at one. It only applies to this. Probably will be different based on different ages, sizes, and densities. Sure enough, that is what he's found since then. In fact, that one he studied turns out to be the anomaly, because almost every subsequent study, the live oak was shown to use more water. But no one covers that, do they? But what he also found out, not just him, but other hydrologists and scientists joined, got on board. And so there's been numerous studies over and over and over. And what they're finding is that anyone who's lived any time in the hill country knows that if you dig a fence post hole here, it's totally different 15 feet away. And that's because our geology underneath is undulating, it's constantly fractured, solid, it's constantly changing. So how much water that tree is using will be totally different from the one that's 15 feet away, because of how much water can they access. And he thinks that the live oak that he said, he went back and he says it looks like it was growing on top of a solid slab limestone, wasn't able to get its roots any deeper. However, they've shown that the mountain cedar can get the roots down about 26 feet, and that kind of approximate range, while live oaks and mesquite and I think gumbo mealy can go down as far as 60 feet. So if you see a large patch of live oaks in the middle of a drought, there's really beautiful big stands and they look healthy and green and juicy in the middle of a drought, that means they have access to cave and they'll be fine no matter what's growing around them. And mountain cedars and live oaks actually have evolved together. They've grown side by side for thousands and thousands of years. But what gets them sometimes is that we have created so much imbalance in the ecosystem is that on many ranches, the large live oaks are the last trees that remain. And so when the birds come in and they eat some of these bushy cedars and they like a lot of times to go to the biggest tree and poop all the seeds. And usually that ends up being the live oak. And that's why you then see all of them coming up underneath. So it's kind of an unnatural situation that we have created. But what they also discovered that because of this variability, it's better when you look at water use, instead of focusing on one tree or one species, look at entire stands of trees. And when you look at the entire stands, the water use doesn't change that much across the board. Oops, wait. It's a hyper little thing. Okay, so what about the interception? I said that, like 70 to 75% was being caught up in that foliage and leaf litter. So I went back to Keith Owens. I said, hey, can you take a second look at the research that was first done here to see if you come up with the same thing? Because as all scientific research is, if you can duplicate it, then it means it's that strengthens the conclusion, right? If you come up with the same results. And so he went back to the drawing board, did the exact same study, followed what had been done before. And he said, yeah, the canopy interception is the same. But what's different is the leaf litter interception. Mine was only 5%. So how in the world did they come up with 70, 75%? He finally went back into their notes of the original research scientists and found out they had included soil moisture, which is where you want the water to be. So when you include the soil moisture with interception, that's going to skew the results. So the final amount was actually only 40% interception, which is about the same as a dense grass of prairie grass. So dense grass of prairie grass intercepts about the same as a cover of mountain cedars. And the other thing on water hogs is that one of the main hydrologists who's been studying this issue for a long time, his name is Dr. Brad Wilcox. He's at Texas A&M. And he was like, all the whole thing of like, yeah, we need to be clearing up mountain cedars, all that. Then he started doing this study where he looked at 4 different rivers in the hill country. 2 of them were the Llano and the Nueces, going back to 1940. And he said, okay, according to my theory, it should show that as the mountain cedar increase, that the base flow from rivers and creeks should go down, right? They decrease if they're really hogging all this water. What he found though is that since the 1940s, the more where woody cover has increased, especially the mountain cedars, is that the base flows has stayed the same or increased. And what they found out. So that set him off on a whole new path. That changed his whole outlook, and he had to restart again to figure out why was this happening. So he got a lot of his students to do these research projects, and they found that underneath these mountain cedars, there's more groundwater because it's more porous. There's more water actually infiltrating. In fact, I just met a student of his last weekend who said that of the large ones, that some of them died from the 2011 drought. They went in there and they cut them at the ground and they measured the interception. So they've been without any live biomass for 10 years. And the infiltration rate is so high underneath those trees. And let's see, I think I have I have another picture in a little bit here that will show you what that looks like. So this is just the graph that's showing the base flows and how they're staying the same or increasing. Then Jack Holland, if anyone knows him from Wimberley, he did an independent study of the Blanco River, found the exact same thing. So 5 different rivers are all showing the same thing. So it really kind of throws the whole idea that they're sucking up all this water to the wind. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're on top of the special limestone with all the aquifers and groundwater. It's very porous and fractured. So it kind of changes the game on a lot of things. So let's see, that's a little bit on water. I could go on and on and on and on for hours on that, but that's all we'll discuss for now. But so the next thing is, are they native and invasive? And I put that in one question. Who here knows why? I would say, are they native / are they invasive? And being that this is a native plant society, the Native Plant Society has formally adopted the definition of the word invasive, meaning non-native plants from elsewhere that are causing harm. However, for decades, hundreds of years, farmers, landowners were calling mountain cedars and mesquites and everything invasive. And so when you suddenly redefine it without explaining to all the landowners, now they think, oh, so it's not native. And so that's an enormous amount of confusion. And so it needs to be clarified that if a plant is invasive, it now means that they're not native. But what about mountain cedar? Is it invasive? Well, we just need to start using another word like encroaching. That might be one way to do it. However, the fact is that mountain cedars are not invasive. And that's because they're actually acting as pioneers. When you look up the word pioneer, a pioneering species is a plant that will spread into an area that has experienced ecological disturbance, like degradation of the soils. A lot of people think when they see the mountain cedars like this, that it caused that, but they didn't cause it. It's poor land management that we're not completely aware of what we've been doing and that it's not working and that we need to adopt different approaches to land management and grazing. Like Steve Nelly, if y'all heard him, he teaches like rotational grazing, things like that you can do to limit the amount of degradation to our soils. So when they're spreading, what they're doing is that they're shading the soil, they're getting their roots down, and they're dropping lots of organic matter. And new research has even shown that as they start to grow, there's not a lot of plants that can grow, especially like in a situation like this, unless it's a plant that can start growing without, like under the ground. Is anyone ever heard of a mycorrhizal fungi? Okay, so it's like that network, right? Under the ground that pops up and makes all the mushrooms and things like that. So it's the mycorrhizal fungi. They can't survive in the degraded conditions, so they go dormant. The juniper is one of the few species that can start growing when they're dormant and activate it. And new research is showing that's exactly what they're doing. They're activating that arbuscular type of mycorrhizal fungi. Once that's activated, then other plants like your oaks and all that can start growing. Oaks are not pioneers. They can't start growing in these conditions by themselves. So, but that kind of brings you into the whole situation that Daniel's going to cover next is then how do we work with these? Can we work with these? What can we do with this if you have the pioneering mountain cedars? And this is one of the things is that they're doing. It's like they're dropping all this organic matter. And if you look underneath them, you'll see over time, at first the leaf litter will be really matted. But then as the rain starts to move through it, it pushes them around to create these little mini berms. And this is the water. This is after rain. The rain collects in those. And it acts as like little detention ponds that will hold that water in place to let it soak into the ground, because that's where we need the water, is in the ground. And also that helps to keep that arbuscular, mycorrhizal fungi going. It gives it that boost that it needs. They also do it with shade, just simply by shading the soil. People ask me, I mentioned all the junipers popping up underneath live oaks. What can you do? Well, obviously, it's an unnatural situation. They're not meant to be that many underneath. And so you can thin them out, like on the north and east side, and keep most of them on the west and south side to continue adding that shade, because the shade and our heat that we can get is much more important. And then their roots. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I have a picture for that. They also jumpstart the soil. I told you about that. Here you go. Here's the picture. This is Dr. Brad Wilcox's study. And I wish that this went a little bit further, but you can see where the ladder is behind there. Do you see how the limestone is real smooth? It's not real cracked or fissured because there's no vegetation above it. But here's where a juniper is. A mountain cedar, look at all the roots. And do you see how broken and fractured it is? Every time it rains, that's going to allow the water to move down. And the thing is that every time it rains, this is, yeah, I know it gets a little more technical here, is that as the rainwater falls, it picks up carbon in the atmosphere. And that combines to make carbonic acid. When that carbonic acid hits the soft sedimentary, limestone, it starts to make all those holes and everything. That's what makes the caves. In fact, dripping down that carbonic acid is what makes the stalagmites and all those things inside of the caves. So it's a very slow process, but how do you think all that stuff gets down into the ground? It doesn't just sit on top. If the ground is hard, that water doesn't soak in, and that limestone stays impenetrable to the water moving in. But the minute that you have these roots not only physically cracking and fracturing, but also moving that water and exuding it down deep so it can make it more porous to increase groundwater porosity. And that is why, with the woody plants spreading, they were able to see that the base flows either stay the same or increase. And here's just a picture over there. Oh, I guess I'll have to do that. The mycorrhizal fungi, right there on the little roots of the plants. Picture your typical matted dense, and that is like that for the first decade or so. And yeah, you don't see a lot of plants coming up underneath at that point, not only because that matted leaf litter is so dense, but also because the soils are still kind of not really good shape and they need more of that fungi to be developed. Okay, so then I asked before, is what Daniel was talking about on, did they always form these vast thickets? Well, in all my reading, I came to realize that the word thickets used historically 150 years ago was referring, and it was Dr. Broomer's comment once when he was describing the thicket, then he followed up by saying all of these mountain cedars have 18-inch, 24-inch diameter trunks, and they were stately trees. And I was like, wait, yeah, that's not the thickets, that scratch and poke me in the eye and all that. And I've come to realize that back then the word thicket was also meant break. A break was something that was physically difficult to walk through that was also had a lot of the same thing. That's what our cedar breaks consisted of, was older trees, not little bushes. Back 150 years ago, most of what we had was this. This is a cedar break, a real cedar break, an old growth cedar break. It was a forest. That's someone with, like Dr. Rivers, they would ride his horse through it easily under the branches. It's a totally different thing. And, so historically they grew inside old growth forests and woodlands where they formed the dominant canopy cover. They were cedar breaks. And this is what the soil looks like underneath an old growth cedar break. You got things like marble seed, orchids. I mean, the list, I have 5 pages in my book of all the plants that can grow underneath these trees, especially once the soil improves over time. And springs flow continuously, sustainably underneath these old growth cedar breaks. And here are examples of what most of them would look like back then. They were big. And who was here who had the property that you said that you had that remnant piece? There you are. She says that she had some like this, huge pieces that were never cut down. So you can find these little remnant jewels, a little snapshot of what it used to look like in the hill country. And that when we say that there was lots of mountain cedars, they were common. In fact, one report, the Texian Advocate said that the Valcones Escarpment was covered with millions of cedars, and not just one or two here and there. But they were trees. And this is something, this is kind of lead into what Daniel's going to talk about. So Daniel's next going to talk about some management options. So when I'm talking about these pioneering thickets, they're like those bushes, multi-trunk bushes. They usually don't get very tall. They don't seem to always grow very long. During droughts, they get the hardest hit. But they're acting as pioneers. They're not really meant to be extremely long-term. And it's like we have to learn to work with them. But we need to also learn to see, when you see this coming up within the context of a woodland or forest, how many here has taken their loppers out and cut them down? I've cut a lot down myself until I realized actually a part of normal woodland forest regeneration. And where they come up real dense, like this little patch here, I mean, normally they kind of come up scattered throughout the forest and woodland is understory. But when you find them coming up real dense, they usually do this where there's like a clearing, like a tree fell or something like that. So there's like a small scale clearing. Soil hasn't really been degraded too bad. And so they come up here and they protect the understory, other new plants coming up. They act as nursery trees. But also, do you see? Here's the difference. You see that? I call them stick cedars. It's right, little sticks, and they're not bushes. Those turn into, let's see, that's what they turn into. That's the cedar break. So it's like, is that there's no reason why we can't thin them out a little bit, especially to remove some of the forked ones and bad ones, but is to manage them to one day become a new forest of. Yes, you have a question.
So what should we call the thing that David Bamberger was famous for getting rid of?
Well, most of what he got rid of were the pioneering thickets. And I wish that he had been more aware. And he knows that he was, when he started doing his stuff, we didn't know anywhere as much as what we know now. And so he was going with what he had. And he admits to me that, there's things he would have done differently. But
what are those things? What would he do differently?
What now?
What would he do differently now?
I don't know. But I do know he says he's not going to use a bulldozer ever again. Because that's tore up the land, as he saw. Is that he does favor using gabions, things like that, and mulching. So I love what Daniel's going to talk about next. So it's Daniel's up, and so he's going to discuss a lot of these new, better options. Yes?
We've been taking all of our single stalk cedars for years and turning them up into like a Christmas tree. But the ones that are multi-branch, is it the same species that just happens to have a single root?
I address that issue briefly in my book because no one knows yet. Okay. And I actually just started research because I want to find out. Because I've had carpenters come to me and everything. They carpenters, they know that wood so well. And they have said, it's a different wood. And we do know that there is a Juniperus ovata, an older, more ancestral juniper from around New Braunfels and Western Hill Country. But all the ones you're talking about, I'm calling tree mountain cedars, it is possible that they're a hybrid between Juniperus ashii and Juniperus ovata, but we don't know. That's just a theory. And it could just simply be a result of growing in better soil. I don't think it's a result of sun, because I find them growing in full sun as well. Exactly. Yeah. So, but it always seems that they do seem to grow up where there's more moisture or soil or something. And so I definitely want to figure that out because I think it will help with management. Definitely. Okay. So next, Daniel.
All right. Thanks, Elizabeth. And thank y'all for your questions and comments. That's going to set up this next section pretty well. I'm going to go kind of quickly because I want us to have plenty of time for questions. Sorry, folks at home. Can you see me? There I am. All right. So especially for folks who are just moving to Texas, just getting into the hill country, when we inherit or acquire the land, that is a remarkable opportunity. And, maybe we read a newspaper article that says, ash juniper, mountain cedar are a water hog. Or maybe we've got an exuberant neighbor who says, I'll tell you what you need to do. But before we get into cut this, plant that, burn this, I think land stewardship, we need to step back. Yes, those practices are really important. You need to know your toolbox and what practices are appropriate in what circumstance. But before we think about those practices or that conservation toolbox, I think it's really important for a landowner to step back and think about their relationship to and responsibility for the land. Each of us is only here for so long. And I think it's really important to just think about your relationship, your connection to your land. And so when we talk about land stewardship or land ethic, that's above all really what we're talking about is what is your connection to the land? And hopefully it's a connection of deep understanding, of admiration, of respect, and I would even say loving the land. And so that is perhaps the most important. And once you have that and a commitment to understanding and taking care of the land, then you can start to delve into the practices, and we'll get into those in a minute. And good land stewardship, this is one of the few things I can think of. Good land stewardship benefits everybody. It benefits you, the landowner, benefits your neighbors, it benefits all of society, and it benefits future generations. So good land stewardship, taking care of the land, is just a remarkable opportunity and responsibility. And what it looks like for you or for you or for you is going to look different. Each of us has our own unique set of values and goals, how we want to use the land, what we want it to look like. And I'm not going to tell you what that should be. That is again, the responsibility and opportunity of the landowner to clarify their goals and their values. But it's important to do that before just reading a newspaper article or listening to a neighbor who says, you need to go do this, this, and this, and this. Step back. What are you trying to do here? Think about it. So whatever land stewardship means to you, my hope is that it embraces ideas of healthy lands and healthy soils. When we think about healthy land, what does that mean? I bet we all have similar but perhaps distinct notions of what a healthy landscape might consist of. Anyone want to shout something out? What do you think of when you think of a healthy landscape? Oh, yeah, I heard diversity. Folks at home, I wish I was monitoring your chats. I'm sure you've got your own ideas. But yeah, first and foremost, we want to have little bare ground. When we have bare ground, it is not armored. It's going to be very vulnerable to rain, and it's going to erode. That's your property, meaning it's being taken down into the Pedernales, into the Colorado River, down to the Gulf. We don't want our pricey hill country property going down into the Gulf. We want it to stay where it is on our property. So yeah, we want to make sure that we're minimizing the amount of bare ground and erosion on our property. Y'all already mentioned diversity. We want a diversity not only of species, but what else? Age class. We want, if we're talking about trees, we want young trees, middle-aged trees. We want old trees, especially along our rivers. We saw in the 2015 Memorial Day flood, landowners who just had big old cypress trees, they all got knocked down. And if you didn't have young cypress to replace them, you're out of luck. So we want a diversity of species and age classes. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have many of the non-native, invasive, aggressive species, but there's a lot that's happened to the hill country, and there's some species like KR bluestem, which realistically we're never going to get rid of, but hopefully you can increase the diversity and abundance of those native species. And we want healthy soils. Elizabeth already talked about healthy soils, talking about them in terms of organic matter, what's happening beneath our feet. There's still so much we're learning about the entire world of microorganisms like bacteria and fungi. I'm just going to touch on a couple of these items. Again, I want to wrap up so we can get to Q&A. So when we talk about little bare ground and erosion, I think people often think of these big gullies. You can stand over here and look at it way over there and say, oh yeah, I've got erosion over there. But erosion isn't always big and ugly and egregious. Sometimes it can be more subtle. This is an example of pedestaling. There's a head cut just downhill below the picture, and basically this landowner is experiencing a little bit of erosion where water is not being slowed down and absorbed well enough, and they're starting to lose a bit of their property. I had to get down on my hands and knees to take this picture. So I guess what I'm saying is get out, walk the land, walk up the hill, down the hill, and study how the water is flowing before you start taking actions. Again, healthy soils. There's so much good information out there as far as how we can maintain soils. Y'all had a phenomenal presenter about 2 years ago speak at the church about the 5 guiding principles, which includes minimizing disturbance. You want to have warm and cool season plants growing, because again, they're taking that carbon, they're feeding the microorganisms like the bacteria and the fungi, growing these great aggregates like cottage cheese to really strengthen that soil, create some good structure, and absorb water. So again, my goal here is encouraging everyone to step back rather than just what do I cut, what do I plant, what do I burn, what do I kill? Think about land stewardship. What is your relationship to your property? What are your goals? What are your values? Think about, what a healthy land means to you. And when we manage for those healthy lands, that provides good function, which allows us to grow palatable plants, whether you're managing for wildlife and or livestock. When we have a landscape like this with great diversity and abundance of plants, when we get a 2-inch or 5-inch rain, that's going to dissipate the energy from that rainfall. So we're not getting the erosion. We're slowing and sinking water, which mitigates flooding. We're going to trap sediment. And when we trap sediment, we're building up the land like a sponge to store water and ultimately feed our aquifers. Again, the list of practices, we could come up with a laundry list of probably 100 different practices that you could do in your uplands, from sustainable and thoughtful grazing and mowing, where and how you control ungulates, whether that's native species like white-tailed deer or exotics like axis deer and feral hogs. We have no shortage of exotic species in the hill country. But I just want to focus on a couple real quick. Slowing down and absorbing water. When we can slow water down, water is carrying small particles of soil. So rather than letting that water take our property off the land down into the Colorado River and the Gulf, if we can slow that water down, whether with rows of cedar slash, this is a row of three rows of cedar logs that landowner outside Bandera established, or just simply rows of small rocks that you can rake together along the hillside on the contour, that's going to slow and sink that water. This was a bare hillside. This landowner, just with a rock rake, created several rows of rocks. Those rocks slowed the water down. When it slowed that water down, that water dropped the sediment that it was carrying. And it's not to say this hillside looks perfect, but there are about 4 different native bunch grasses that have established on their own, just by slowing the water down, trapping the sediment, and then seeds will start to germinate on their own. Thoughtful brush management. I'm going to whiz through this real fast, y'all, because I think we're getting close to 8 o'clock. But there are some sort of general recommendations for if you do want to remove, especially some of that bushy cedar. There's plenty of compelling reasons to do so. I'm not telling you don't remove cedar. Elizabeth isn't saying don't remove cedar, but we're encouraging sort of a thoughtfulness and finding a good balance. And there's plenty of compelling reasons to remove that bushy cedar. Perhaps you want to improve forage for livestock. Perhaps you need to reduce fuel loads or create access. Some landowners will buy their property and it's so chock full of bushy cedar that there's not even a place to build your house. And so there's plenty of reasons to remove some. But again, clarify what it is you're trying to do. Are we trying to improve agricultural productivity? Are we reducing fuel loads, creating access for ranch roads and trails? What are we doing? Perhaps you're managing for wildlife and want a diversity of microhabitats. Great. But first figure out what are the goals? What are we trying to do here? Leo, hopefully this picture looks familiar. And there's a lot of ways that you can achieve these goals through thoughtful brush management. So again, these are just some general recommendations. I'm going to try to zoom through them pretty quickly. On those steep slopes, Elizabeth talked about this. There's only so many plants that can handle caliche and get established. And for better or worse, ash juniper, mountain cedar is one of those species. And so be really careful on if, when, and how you're going to remove some of that cedar on those steep slopes. And if you absolutely need to, think about leaving some of that woody debris on site. Because again, it's going to act like these structures from the previous page, slow that water down, trap some sediment. So be really careful on those slopes. Perhaps you don't do a wholesale removal. You can thin it. You can create strips of habitat refuge. Not only is this creating habitat refuge, but those real bushy cedars, what are they doing? They're protecting these plants from our hugely overabundant population of white-tailed deer. So not only are they acting like wildlife habitat, but they're nursery trees for all sorts of herbaceous and woody species. Again, Elizabeth has 5 pages of plants in her book that do well with ash juniper. We heard earlier, perhaps we think about removing some of the smaller cedars. And there's a lot of ways to do that, whether with the prescribed burn in the winter, or as we saw in the previous picture, you can cut off some of the lower branches, allow more sunlight to get through, but be thoughtful, find a good balance. It's going to look different for each landowner. But again, we can create all sorts of diversity by leaving some on the property. What does it say? And again, as we saw in that previous picture, if you can remove all those lower branches, you can get some good sunlight onto the ground and a bunch of native grasses growing on their own. You might not need to seed. So J. David Bamberger, someone asked, what would he have done differently? I've heard him say 2 things that he would have done differently. One, Elizabeth already touched on. He would have never taken that heavy equipment up on the hillside. So he caused quite a bit of erosion doing that. The second thing he said is he wouldn't have spent, I don't know how many thousands of dollars, millions on a native seed. You know, there's oftentimes a native seed bank still in the soil. And so you might not need to rush to the store and buy a bunch of seed. It may be there right in the soil bank. So those are the 2 things I've heard J. David say he would do differently. We touched briefly on how mountain cedar was used in the past. People built shingles on their roofs. They built their homes, their corrals, the railroads. They made charcoal. They made their fences. They created all sorts of stuff with that wood. Why? What's that?
They also used them for telegraph poles and telephone poles.
Telephone poles, yes, all sorts of amazing things. And just as our ancestors used it for all sorts of purposes, it's a great resource today as well. I tell landowners, if you're going to thin your bushy cedar, you've got a free Home Depot sitting on your land. So sure, you might need to pile up some and burn it, but before you do that, my gosh, think about that free, resilient, great resource there. Perhaps you're creating mulch to protect the soil. If you're going to create slash or soil, don't go too thick, maybe just an inch or 2. Otherwise, it'll take a while for things to germinate. If you go, again, more than about 2 inches. Use branches, again, to slow and sink water. When you're slowing and sinking water, you're going to trap sediment. This is a landowner here in Gillespie County who built a road up a steep hill, caused a huge amount of erosion. And so what did he do? He put bushy branches of ash juniper, mountain cedar, going along the contour. And today, it's not perfect, but it looks really good. A lot of native bunch grasses have established on that hillside. So again, use those branches to slow and sink water, trap sediment. And one of my favorite things to do, again, because of all of the native whitetail and exotic free-range access that we have here in Gillespie County, that's free fencing right there. If you're trying to plant your native seedlings or saplings and you don't want deer to eat them, I like donuts. And so I always use donuts as an analogy. But, plant your seedling or sapling and make a donut or a corral with that slash around it. You've got the free material right there on your property. So again, it was a resource that our ancestors used in the past, and we should keep using it today. With that, Elizabeth, you're going to bring it home, and then we're going to take questions from folks here in person and on Zoom as well. So Zoomers, start typing in your questions, and Craig's going to.
So when Daniel was talking about, some of the historical uses of the mountain cedar, one of the first things I talk about in my book is how historically people valued and respected the tree. In fact, at one point, it was attributed to helping to jumpstart the hill country economy. And that was, it was incredibly valuable resource, as only because most of those tall, big tree cedars were cut down, and then the bushy ones took over. Is that now a lot of people hate the tree. And so a lot of my book is trying to get people to reassess and to learn how to value them again. We don't have to love them, but at least to appreciate and learn to work with them and to learn why they're here. So therefore, the most important thing to do is to is to learn to see the difference between these pioneering thickets of bushy cedars. And like I said, excuse me, is that they're bushes, multi-trunk bushes, usually not very tall. If they continue to live over 200 to 300 years, then they will evolve and become these like real twisted, cool looking, trees. But they always will really look like large bushes, no matter what. They're not the single trunk, well-defined trees that we used to have. And so where you do have that mountain cedar tree cover is to manage it as woodland and forest where possible. Where you have those stick cedars, don't take them all out. It's try to see them that those are not part of the pioneering clan. They're part of the normal part of woodland and forest regrowth. And that where these pioneering thickets are growing, that they're not the problem. They didn't cause the degraded soils. They didn't cause our springs to go dry. They didn't do all these things. They're a symptom of a bigger problem, and that is degraded soils. And it's just poor management of, we didn't know better. When we came here to the hill country, we didn't know we'd have droughts and mega droughts, flash floods, that our soils are so thin. When I was, I went to college actually in Virginia and studied in those mountains, and the soil there is like 20 to 30 feet deep or something. We never hit bedrock. And so whenever people that did clear cutting there, the forest would regenerate within 60 years and look just like it had before it had been cut. That doesn't happen here. So we're learning, and we need to find a better way, more sustainable ways to go forward. And so the biggest thing, as Daniel was emphasizing, is we need to shift our focus away from mountain cedars. Instead of focusing on that, instead is to focus on the soil. Everything we should do should be about the soil, because it starts with the soil. More water, better growing conditions, healthier plants, more fire-resistant vegetation. All these things start with the soil. Better development of aquifers underneath, more consistent flows to our springs. It's all about the soil. And also, Daniel mentioned a few things, is that we need to find more ways to offset the cost by focusing on the ways we can use these pioneering thickets. I think we should try not to really find uses for the old growth like woodlands and forests. There's so few left. And so one of the chapters in my book, I go through all these different ways. And one way is that still we need some entrepreneurs to go out there, is that they found a way to dehydrate and dry, like kiln dry, the branches and the foliage of these bushy cedars and use it as a feed supplement. And they've studied it on lambs, but that could be applied to other things, and as opposed to cottonseed hulls, that husk, that it is a substitute for that, and that they found just the same, if not better, resistance. In fact, it seemed to impart a little bit of resistance to some of the insects and diseases. So it's things like that. Is to find more ways, and just by doing that, maybe we see more economic benefits of it. It's going to help offset costs and also increase the amount of respect people can have. I mean, they are just not seen as a plague, a weed, a bane on civilization. But the biggest picture of all is that we need to see the hill country for what it is: a fragile, dynamic, incredibly diverse region, where simple answers and solutions are not sustainable. We can't just come up with a simple answer. That's why my book is 600 pages long. I couldn't do it. I couldn't, because the more I studied and researched, the more I realized how complex it is, especially when you start going under the ground. It is a very, very complex, rich, at the convergence of multiple ecosystems, ecological regions. So we need to treat it like that. And let's try to keep it that way. Anyway, thank you. Questions? Yes. Daniel, what
is there a significant difference in the cedar, how the cedar develops in granite soils versus limestone soils? Because we have a huge amount of granite soils.
I know. In the granite upland, the mountain cedar mostly just grows wherever you do have some of that exposed limestone. and it sometimes will pop up in the granite, and it just doesn't seem to really like it as much. And it does seem more susceptible to droughts. That's what I definitely have seen, is that, following that 2011 drought, like around Camp Longhorn and stuff like that, there's a tremendous amount of mass diebacks, more so it seems in the granite region. I just don't think that they're able to access that down 25 feet, the cave waters that really keep them going through these droughts. Yes?
We heard tonight pertains to red-berry cedar.
And can you repeat the question for the folks at home?
You just want to know about how much?
I want to know, we've heard a lot of wisdom here tonight. How much of it pertains to red-berry cedar?
Not as much. Red-berry juniper is what he asked about, which is Juniper cinchona, and it starts a little bit west of here and picks up and heads more west, and has a very large range throughout the central west Texas. I had thought about it a little bit, and I didn't. I ended up not focusing on it because it doesn't seem to. The mountain cedar follows karst geology. That's that porous limestone I was talking about, while red-berry juniper seems to be all over the place and not really have as much of a focus on certain type of soils. And they do just stay as bushes. They don't seem to have ever formed any kind of trees. And so their numbers were definitely not as plentiful in the past. They were definitely more like in draws and things like that, which is anything that was growing west of the 100th meridian. It was mostly grass historically.
Well, I just wonder whether, it has got a reputation that blueberry juniper did a while back. I wonder if maybe we have misconceptions about red-berry juniper also.
Yeah, probably. I would think that any water use study or something like that needs to go readdressed. So any of that kind of research needs to be readdressed, although it's mostly the water use studies on the mountain cedar that has been applied to a lot of junipers. It seems that for some reason the focus has mostly been on the mountain cedars in the hill country, even though they were probably extremely abundant in the past. They might have been more well served to target some of the other junipers, but the red-berry juniper, it grows on top of different situations and stuff like that. And I love the hill country, so I just focus on the mountain cedar in the hill country.
All right, we have a question up front, and then Leo, we're going to get you in the back.
You refer to the mountain cedar and asked juniper. Why does this tree have two names, Carlos?
So I'm going to repeat the question for the folks on Zoom. We talked at the very beginning, and actually really throughout, we sort of went back and forth calling this tree mountain cedar and ash juniper. Why is that? Why does this one tree have a variety of common names?
When the settlers got here 150 years ago, some of them knew that they were junipers, but they were already, a lot of them came from the East Coast where they had eastern red cedar. When they got here, they just called it mountain cedar to distinguish from the eastern red cedar. And it wasn't until 1932 that it started to be called ash juniper. And because a lot of my book kind of goes and reflects on the history of the tree, I decided to call it mountain cedar. So that was just a preference, although, yes, you can go either way.
All right. Leo in the back.
This is what I'd like to get thoughts on the role of the influence of fires to juniper. One of the things that you frequently hear are people that say, well, there used to be a lot more fires. We used to keep it clear. It used to be the prairie grass and fires. But when you think about it, I've been here a long time now, and I don't recall natural fire ever getting started. There were no lightning fires that I ever heard of in my recollection. There have been plenty of brush fires, plenty of cedar wood fires, but virtually all of them are man-made, man-related. And if you take away the influence of man and you go back thousands of years where there was very little, human influence, the only conceivable source of fire in these parts would be lightning. And usually that occurs in wet times of year associated with thunderstorms that are wet. And I just don't think they occurred very often. I think this was a relatively fire-free zone short of humans.
That's also a chat question.
All right. So yes, there's a question here in person and also a similar one on Zoom. It's really asking about, historically, what did the fire regime look like in the hill country, and sort of what does that mean in terms of what we may have seen related to ash juniper / mountain cedar?
Okay, well, what is it? Might be the TC care. I can't remember in my book. I mentioned there's a study that shows in Texas, 95% of our fires are started by people. Mm-hmm. When you take away 95%, there's a 5% chance that lightning can start a fire. I mean, right there, that kind of tells you that the fires could not have been as common. The other thing, as I discussed with Dr. Fred Smines at A&M, is that, like I said, the hill country is like this. Even if a fire got started in an area, it could not have traveled as well as it could have in the Great Plains. In the Great Plains, it was wide open and even, had grass continuously. And so a fire, once it got started, could continue to go, and the wind was much stronger. They just kept pushing. I also, I talked to Lee Pond Apaches, and I talked to Tonkawas, which a lot of people don't do that, but I said, no, I'm going to go ask them and see what they say. And the Tonkawas said, no, we didn't burn that often. Every now and then, just to kind of attract the buffalo or something like that. The Lee Pond Apache said we did a little bit more. It's mainly around like the headwaters of the San Saba River because the buffalo really like that area. Think about it. If you don't have horses, why would you burn everything? Why would you not instead burn and select areas to bring the buffalo to you? Now, that being said, I have another theory about, remember when Daniel was talking about how some of the hills were just like, they were like almost bald, like almost just grass. I think that is possible because I was staying on top of the plateau one day and I saw it. I think they might have been used as signal hills. Mm-hmm. I think that the Native Americans might have burned them to, kept them burned so that they could send signals to each other. And I mean, it kind of makes sense, but that's like a whole other research project to do. So what do I think that, what was the interval? Well, a lot of times these days people are saying every 3 to 12 years. I do not agree that the only reason you would have to burn that often is if your soils are degraded and that grass cannot form a dense, thick cover. Because I managed a property, and that was the one that I took you to, where the grass was dense and thick. And we added even a little bit of cow manure compost to little patches here and there. And it was about 1.5 acres. And we took out all the woody plants, all the mountain cedars, everything. So it was just this grass. It was KR. Then the livestock were removed. And about 3 years later, it was solid Indian grass, little blue stem. That's what dominated. And it was so thick that when you walked, you couldn't feel your feet touching the ground. That's what it used to be like. And 20 years later, still, there's not one woody plant in there. Now, this grass looks tired, which means that, but I think they could have been the buffalo moving through that would eat them down and recycled it and then moved on. It would have been really quick. And a fire could have gone through. I'm not saying that fires could not have gone through in these areas. But in the 1970s, a report was put out that said that the fire in the bowl in the hill country was like every 20, 30 years. In some areas, 30 to 100 years in other areas. So how they go from that to every 3 to 12 years, and I think it's just is that there's this belief that the only way to maintain the grass is by fire, when that should almost be like a companion to restoring the soil. I think that's more important to restore the soil so you get the grass really, really strong and healthy, thick and dense, which is going to make better erosion control, have more water infiltration, all that. Does that answer your question?
Let's real quick, Craig, do we have any questions? I want to make sure folks who are participating online can get engaged as well.
There are several. The first one, I think it was in reference to something you said specifically, Daniel. What are fuel loads? So
the question was around fuel loads. So there's when you can get basically a lot of biomass, a lot of vegetation around your house, sometimes landowners will partner with, especially an organization like Texas A&M Forest Service, to look at ways to reduce some of that vegetation or biomass around your home and other infrastructure to reduce threats related to wildfires.
Talking about mulching, maybe 1 inch. Yeah. The situation I had in particular did the property to the driveway to build my house. They didn't mulch it, they shredded it. And shredding it created big piles of heavy stuff. It's covering the grass. And I completely love it the way it is. And I'm hoping that the grass will grow up through that. It's more than 1 inch. It's going to be about 4 inches, number one. And number two, where they sheared off, they used one of those cedar machines, where they did chop up some of the stumps. There's still about a 12-inch rise of the stump left over. And I thought, well, should I remove it? Just leave it and hope that something grows out of that someday? Or, it's intruding on the cow going to the driveway. I don't care about that. But still, I need to know, should it be removed or leave it alone?
I think it will resprout when it's that high up. You have to cut it more at the ground so it doesn't resprout. So let's just wait and see. If it doesn't resprout, then you're good. But definitely don't remove the roots. I do know that there are companies out there that are digging the roots out. Don't ever do that, because then you destroy the soil. As for the shredding versus mulching, that's probably more what Daniel was meaning, is that rough shredding as opposed to that fine mulching. And 4 inches, no. That is way too deep, and it will take forever.
So there's a variety of things that you can do. Again, you're the landowner, you're the boss, but it depends on what you're aiming for. But one thing you could do, the smartest answer is usually it depends. That's the smartest answer to these types of questions. It depends. But let's say your property is not on too steep a hill. There's not a huge amount of water coming down. Then one thing you could do is think about, just as this landowner used a rock rake and made these little berms with the rocks, one thing you could think about doing is, in a few spots, maybe raking it together and forming a few berms sort of up the hillside. Labor intensive, yes. Perhaps you've got some friendly family members, neighbors, so forth, who could help you out. But that's one idea.
It's just that if it's 4 inches deep, it could take a lot longer for the grasses to grow up.
They will germinate. It'll just take a while.
Yeah. Yes.
With all the people moving to the hill country and the dividing up of all the ranches and mini ranches, everybody punching a hole for a new well. Agriculture industry taking water out of the aquifers. What's your estimate, or estimate you may have seen, as to when or if we're going to run out of water?
I'm going to let Elizabeth take that question and repeat it for the folks at home.
Yeah, so he was asking, when are we going to run out of water if all these people keep coming and moving into the hill country? When is too many people going to be too many people? I have spoken to some like aquifer specialists who are, they see the worst case scenario. They say by 2050, if we don't take the right steps, there's no reason why we can't accommodate more people. We just need to, too many straws in the Coke can. We need to find ways to get more rainwater collection. Things like that. It's like, and to restore the soils. So much of our rainwater just bypasses us.
And I'll just say there's a lot of solutions, and there's a lot of organizations, Hill Country Alliance and dozens of others, who are trying to advance solutions, from the policy side with our groundwater conservation districts and groundwater management areas, to working with new landowners to think about how to enhance soil health, rainwater catchment, working with school districts and local governments to try to create more innovative water infrastructure that reuses not only rainwater, but air conditioning, condensate, wastewater. All that water can be reused and repurposed. So there's a bunch of solutions. There's a lot of organizations that are working across the Hill Country to make sure that the answer is no time soon.
Exactly. I'm not.
You know, David,
Yes.
I just got an email from David about that. If you'd like to see the an article about our upcoming water shortage and what's anticipated and what can be done.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that was a webinar that was just hosted with the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University and the Environmental Defense Fund. Both just came out with 2 reports that essentially say, yes, we're going to run out of water unless we start taking more thoughtful measures. And one of the recommendations that is touched on is trying to advance innovation through our local groundwater conservation districts.
I think it's important. We have a serious tax policy. Ways and other
Exactly.
And that's the real problem. We keep my tax is sky high. It's mind-boggling how much has changed. It's a state rule that has changed the evaluation, and it almost forces you to run way too many cattle, or to run cattle where you shouldn't be running cattle. Can you hear all that? Yeah.
Yeah, but people don't make money
But
on
if you do that very long, then you've got it the other direction. So you've got to be a balance somewhere.
Well, the thing is that, I'm a strong believer that, if we don't have buffalo, we can use the livestock to help restore our soils and our grasses and all that. But I'm thinking like bring back the cowboys and brand them with like little markers instead of like hot iron, and to move them from ranches to ranches.
And there are lots of partners trying to figure out how to scale that up as well. There certainly are producers who are already moving their livestock around, but there's a lot of challenges to really scaling up those solutions. Craig.
There are 2 questions on chat that have not been addressed yet.
Let's do it.
One of them is kind of a quick one. It says, how much acreage of old growth mountain cedar still exists?
All right. The question is from the Zoom chat, how much old growth mountain cedar exists in the Hill Country? And I am so glad that I have Elizabeth here to try to come up with an answer.
I still haven't been able to find old mountain growth mountain cedar. It's very tough because people will say, oh, I have old growth, and I go, and it's not old growth. It has to be like at least 250 years old, it has to have all these other attributes and all that.
My answer is not enough, and also pay Elizabeth a really great amount of money to come out to your property to check it out.
I mean, at this point, what I have seen, it probably comes to about maybe 200 acres. Not enough. When you consider the fact that this area was just covered before.
All right, Craig, one more from online and then we'll come back here.
We have 5 minutes before the Zoom meeting is going to terminate. So
all right.
The last question here. What do you think of state and local cedar removal programs? And
the question is, what do we think of state and federal programs to remove ash juniper mountain cedar? I'll take a first stab. Again, Elizabeth and I aren't saying don't remove any cedar at all. But what we're saying is think about it in the context of healthy soils and healthy lands, and do so in just a thoughtful, deliberate manner. I'm going to let Elizabeth take her
I think that most of them are based on old, outdated data. Like the water supply enhancement plan was still using that 70 to 75% interception number to justify taking them out. And again, I don't think it should be. Why can't we come out with a new plan that's all about soil restoration, that you change the focus to the soil and then everything else follows that? Because what we've been doing has not been working.
All right, we had a question over here, I think.
I've got one kind of the opposite direction. I've got 43 acres, lots and lots of big cedar. I've got several of them that are just dying. And I've noticed there is some really grass in the area. Can cedar die if it gets too much water in the cedar area?
That's interesting. Yeah, I've seen that happen.
The question is, can mountain cedar potentially die from having too much water?
Yeah, I worked at the Natural Gardener Nursery for a year in Austin. And when it was so hot, I said, let's put all the plants underneath the big mountain cedar so we don't have to water as much, because the shade, would make it go longer. And so we'd be just guzzling water on those trees every day. And within 6 months, they were all dead. So I was like, oh, wow, shoot, I felt horrible. But yeah, it's probably... and it's like that, and I've seen all the same where because that just like switchgrass, Lindheimer muley, bushy blue stem, something like that. It's going to be an indicator that you got those wet areas underneath.